So, yesterday I was looking online and someone brought up the fact that this week marks a decade since issue 247 came out of Archie Sonic. And issue 247 is infamous for being basically the last issue in the Mecha, that's Mecha, Mecha Sally arc that ran from basically the ending of 230 to basically the ending of 247. Basically 17 issues in a row. Well, 16 and a half issues because I think it was 242 that was used mostly, the main portion of it was used mostly for advertisements of some kind of, I guess you could say, partnership that Sega had with the Olympics or whatever. They used it basically to, I guess you could say, you know, commercialize the partnership with the Olympics or the Mario Sonic Olympic thing or whatever it was. And then the secondary story was more connected to the main story. So basically, 16 and a half issues of the main comic in about, I would say, 4 to 8 issues maybe of the universe. And when you combine those together, 16 into 8, you are looking at about 24 issues, almost 2 years of story within the span of a year and a half. And I think a lot of people, even I've mentioned it many times, have pretty much agreed that this was probably the biggest mistake, Archie Sonic could have made. I mean, at first, there's no doubt that some people were intrigued by it, because of the fact that, hey, it's something different, it's in the hands of Ian Flynn. He might, he might go in a different direction with it, stuff like that. But instead, what did we end up with? We ended up basically with a story that was more rinse and repeat after the whole introduction of Sally as Mecha Sally being weaponized. All we had was rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, with a few moments here and there, but it was mostly rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And that was about it as I check to make sure the mic's on. Okay, it is. But like I said, it was more rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And pretty much after a while, people that even supported it started to get bored with it. It's like, okay, get to the point. Get to the point of the story. When are we going to have that, significant moment in the story to where whether or not, Sally does somehow start to regain her free will, even through the usage of the modified power ring, which again to me makes no freaking sense how, Ian Flynn could write, a scenario where Eggman modifies it to prevent free will, when pretty much anybody that's followed Sonic lore all across media knows that it does, exactly what, he's trying, that in story Eggman is trying to prevent it from doing, and that's basically, give free will to roboticized citizens. It's like it just didn't make sense. It's like where was the answer to it in the long run, And again, I get, I get the fact as I just checked something here. I get the fact that Ian wants Ian wanted, and everybody still sticks to this, including me, mostly me. He wanted to create his own magnum opus. When it came to the Archie Sonic. He saw what Ian did with Endgame, and he wanted to basically do his own version of that, but if not bigger, and I guess in his mind, better. And well, I'll give him credit, he tried, but in the end, he failed. He absolutely failed. And of course, I could see him seeing events like Crisis on Infinite Earths from DC, Secret Wars, New 52, and all of them, as event comics, basically being his inspiration to want to try to create an event comic himself. But it's like, those stories became event comics and became cult classics because, in a way, whether you agree with them or not, they actually worked and made sense to some degree. The Mecha Sally arc, at first, I'll say it, I've said it before, at first looked like it was off to a promising start, but then it just fell flat. It just fell flat. And the big difference between those event comics and Mecha Sally, again, you may have not agreed with some of the things that they did there, but they never once really did any true rinse and repeat. I mean, there were some occasions and some issues, yes, they did, but most times it was something different all the time, to keep people invested, to keep them interested. So I can understand that when Ian did this story, he wanted to do something that would basically solidify him as, the future Sonic writer of comic books and possibly other Sonic media for years to come. Because, you never knew what you were going to get from him. And mostly, you never expected him to do something like this with, a very popular character in Sally Acorn. You never expected it. But yeah, when you look back at this now, a decade later, after, since its last issue came out, when you look back on it, as I've said before many times and others have said, it was probably not the best idea. It was probably not the best idea. I mean, Cyberpunk Jordan, whose channel you should check out, Cyberpunk Jordan, CJ, if you will, he basically said it best, that this is an example of not understanding your audience. And you think Ian Flynn would understand said audience since he came from said audience, but he didn't. And that's why a lot of people look at this Mecha Sally arc like, fans don't want this. Fans don't want to see Sally in this situation. You don't want to see the freedom fighters in this situation. What do you not understand from being part of the fan base yourself that this is not the direction fans want you to go in? And even if you wanted to, you should know better than to drag it on for days upon, for days and months upon months and days upon days upon days, drag it on for so long that at the least you could have gone just for 6 issues in the main comic, 4 issues in the spin-off, and be done with it. Or if you want to, at most, a year's worth of story with, maybe 6 issues of the spin-off as well, and there you go. Within a year, you have basically, let's say, a year and a half worth of story, you're done. Don't drag it out for so long because you want to make a point. You want to make a point. And that's the one thing we all have to look at when, looking back now officially a decade later since this arc ended. That Ian Flynn, what he was doing, and the guy's a great writer, don't get me wrong. I've had my issues with him, courtesy of his message boards and all that. Don't get me wrong. But, don't get me wrong about that, okay? I've had my issues with him where basically I've pretty much, guessed what was going to happen before it even happened. And there were some at the Saturday morning Sonic forums that even credited me with pretty much figuring out what was going to happen in that issue or within the next couple of issues or within the story. So I've had my problems with Ian sometimes, when it comes to that, because he didn't like the fact that somebody pretty much figured out, what was going to happen next. So I've had my issues. Don't get me wrong about that. But with all due respect, I will admit he is a good writer. He knows how to write a decent story. The soft retcon reboot or reboot retcon that started with 252 is a great example of that. It really is. It is a great example of that. But, when you look back at this story, at this attempt as a magnum opus, that he was trying for, it was also the fact that he was trying to make a point. And that point was that, not just, he was going to be pretty much featured, I guess you could say, a featured prominent writer when it came to anything Sonic, comic book, or media related, like I mentioned earlier, but that basically he was trying to make a point that as a fan himself, he could write a better story than those that have been in the business a lot longer, like a Carl Bowlers, like a Ken Penders, and whoever else, came before. He wanted to make a point that he could do a better job, as a fan. He could do a better job. He could go in directions and do things they wouldn't even attempt to do. And I'll give him credit for trying. But obviously he lost his footing. He lost his focus when it came to this arc. He lost his focus by going into a rinse and repeat situation that he did not need to go into. Again, all he had to do was focus on how to get from point A to point B and be done. That's all he had to focus on. And you could have done that, as I just mentioned earlier, within the span of 6 issues in the main comic and 4 issues of the spin-off, or a year's worth of the main and 6 issues of the spin-off, and that's it. You would have gotten everything done and complete by that time. But yet he wanted to basically make his mark. He wanted to make his mark with this story. And why? Because again, I think it's more of an ego situation. An ego situation to prove that as a fan, he could do a better job than someone that's established, controversially or not, in this business for so long in Ken Penders. He wanted to prove he could do a better job. And look, again, I'll give him credit, all the credit in the world. I will give him credit. They check my time here. They only let you do about 14 minutes with 4K on this camera. But again, I'll give him credit, all the credit in the world, for trying. But there's a difference, basically, between, there's a difference between trying to make a statement, trying to prove your point, and basically going with what's, less stressful, less convoluted, and more simpler. There's a difference between those two. And if he would have gone with the less stressful, less convoluted, more simpler approach, then I think he could have got this story knocked out within the span of, like, let's say, as I mentioned, six issues at the most, at the realistic most, if you will. But he didn't want to do that. And then on top of that, when you hear what people say afterwards, after the arc is done, like Ben Bates and others that worked with him, the fact that he originally wanted this to go a lot further, that the Sally that was going to get restored would not be the real Sally, and then Sonic would have to spend another, 25, 50 issues trying to find the real Sally. It's like, it's like, come on. Come on. It's like, what were you thinking at the time? Were you so determined, were you so desperate to make a point that you could do a better job than those that have been in the business for longer than you? Were you that determined to prove that you could be just as good, if not better? Because I think at the end of the day, when you look back at the storyline, a decade later now, I think that's obviously what he was trying to do. Was he was trying to make a point that he could be just as, that a fan, that a fan himself, that is now an official head writer in a comic book, in an established licensed comic book or official comic book of any kind, could do a better job than those that have been doing it for years, if not decades. And if that's the case, he failed on all scales. He failed on all scales. But yeah, I think honestly, at the end of the day, looking back on it a decade later, I think that's why he did this. He wanted to make a point. He wanted to make a point and make his mark on this industry, that he could do a better job from a fan, from a fan's perspective, than those that have been in the business, for decades, if not years, like a Penders and a Bowler. But what are your guys' thoughts? Do you think Ian was trying to make a point, trying to prove that a fan could do a better job than those that have been in the business, experience-wise for decades and years? What are your thoughts? Let me know down below in the comments. And until next time, I'll talk to y'all later.